You knew where it was without thinking: down the road, on the corner by the post office, or at the end of the lane where the village ran out of houses. The door was heavy and the hinge was stiff, and when it closed behind you, the world went quiet. It smelled of damp metal and old paper and something you could not name. The receiver was cold and solid and weighed more than a modern phone does now. You pressed button A to connect and button B to get your money back if no one answered, and everyone who grew up in Britain before 1990 knows exactly what those buttons felt like. At its peak, Britain had over 92,000 red telephone boxes. Today, fewer than 21,000 remain in operation. Thousands have been stripped of their phones entirely. Hundreds have been sold for £1. And the story of how that happened is not a story about mobile phones. It is a story about what happens when a public asset is handed to a private company, and the public is never asked what it was worth. The General Post Office drew the blueprint for this public asset in 1924, launching a design competition to replace its early concrete kiosks. The winning entry came from Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, a prominent architect who would later design Battersea Power Station and Bankside. Scott did not view the kiosk as mere street equipment, but as a classical civic structure, drawing inspiration from Sir John Soane's neoclassical mausoleum. His creation, the K2, entered service in 1927. Cast in heavy iron panels with a domed roof and a prominent crown insignia, it was engineered to withstand both harsh British weather and urban vandalism. While Scott originally proposed a subtle silver finish, the Post Office engineering department overruled his choice, insisting on a bright post office red paint to ensure high visibility on crowded, foggy streets. In 1936, the Post Office introduced the K6, or Jubilee kiosk, to mark the Silver Jubilee of King George V. This model refined Scott's design, retaining the cast-iron frame and Post Office red livery, but reducing the weight by 25% and shrinking its footprint. The K6 became the vehicle for a massive national expansion, carrying telephone service into narrow city streets and remote rural villages. By the late 1970s, the network reached more than 92,000 boxes across the British countryside. The policy of the General Post Office was clear: every community deserved a connection regardless of profitability. This systematic deployment created the most densely networked public telephone system in the world per capita, turning Scott's classical iron kiosks into a permanent, uniform layer of the national fabric. In 1980, the state-run GPO telephones became British Telecom. 4 years later, in November 1984, the government floated the company on the London Stock Exchange, raising nearly £4 billion. This privatization instantly shifted the nation's 92,000 phone boxes from public infrastructure to a private corporate balance sheet. British Telecom was still bound by a statutory universal service obligation to maintain public call boxes, but the legislation only required them where they were reasonably required. This vague wording allowed commercial logic to dictate the future of the network. The privatization agreement contained no obligation to preserve Scott's classic cast-iron designs. Looking to cut high maintenance costs, British Telecom launched a major modernization scheme in 1985, introducing the Cake 100 kiosk. Constructed from glass-filled steel panels rather than heavy cast iron, the Cake 100 was 30% lighter and far cheaper to manufacture. Later, glass and steel case variants followed, abandoning the bright red livery entirely. These flat-faced functional structures rapidly replaced the red K6 boxes on high streets, establishing a new focus on corporate efficiency before mobile phones had even arrived. The arrival of the mobile phone quickly turned BT's newly modernized payphone network into an expensive liability. In 2000, mobile phone penetration passed 50% of the UK population. By 2007, that figure reached 90%. As personal handsets became standard pocket equipment, public callbox usage plummeted, and the economics of the street-level kiosk collapsed. A box that generated an average of £1,200 per year in 1995 brought in under £80 by 2010, rendering thousands of structures financially untenable under the company's private commercial logic. To stem these losses, BT began applying to the telecommunications regulator, Ofcom, to systematically decommission and remove low-revenue kiosks. Under the established process, BT was required to notify local authorities of its plans. While local councils were granted a consultative role to raise objections, they possessed no statutory veto to halt the process. With the regulatory pathway clear, the landscape changed rapidly. Between 2002 and 2014, BT removed approximately 37,000 telephone boxes from British streets. This phase marked the fastest peacetime removal of a piece of national infrastructure in British history, dismantling a network designed to serve everyone and replacing it with empty pavements. In 2008, British Telecom offered an alternative path for the remaining structures, launching the Adopt a Kiosk scheme. Under the terms of the programme, local councils, registered charities and community groups could purchase a decommissioned K6 box for exactly £1. By 2023, communities had adopted more than 6,000 boxes across the country. Inside these red cast-iron shells, volunteers installed automated defibrillators, shelving for mini libraries, local history boards, and art displays. The scheme carried a dual meaning. On one side, it stood as a model of civic action, allowing local residents to save and repurpose familiar landmarks. On the other, it represented a systematic transfer of ongoing maintenance costs from a privatized corporation to unpaid local volunteers. Public infrastructure, built and maintained at public expense for 60 years, was handed back to the public for £1, shifting the responsibility of preservation from corporate ledger to local community. By 2024, approximately 5,000 boxes survived under Ofcom regulations, which established a safety net for some of the remaining network, preventing the removal of kiosks in areas with poor mobile coverage or on roads with high accident rates. Many of those boxes were operated at a loss because they remained essential emergency links. Separately, a layer of heritage protection preserved other kiosks. English Heritage designated more than 2,000 classic K6 boxes as Grade 2 listed structures, legally protecting them from demolition or alteration. But this protection only applied to designated historic boxes. For the unlisted majority of the network, BT retained sole authority over decommissioning. The company could decide to remove these structures without any requirement for public consultation or environmental impact assessments, leaving local communities with little say in the sudden disappearance of their street infrastructure. The transition from public utility to decorative street feature obscures a practical reality. The service these red boxes provided was not always fully replaced. While the rise of mobile networks fueled a broad assumption that public payphones were obsolete, digital connectivity remains unequal. As of 2024, 7% of the United Kingdom's landmass still lacks any reliable mobile signal. In these isolated rural areas during winter power outages or sudden highway emergencies, a physical landline is far from a historical novelty. It is a dependable last line of defense. When local power grids fail and mobile transmitters go dark, the copper wires inside a kiosk often remain the sole link to help. Removing a box where cellular networks fail to reach leaves people with no emergency fallback at all. Today, most surviving boxes exist as quiet ornaments, standing as beautifully maintained monuments containing operational but silent handsets that almost no one ever lifts. Today, these kiosks stand as monuments to a forgotten consensus that public connection is a shared right, not a private commodity. If this story interested you, there is a video right here about what happened to the British Post Office. Subscribe for more.